Okay, so today we're looking into a case that I think really gets you thinking about how well you can really know a person. We're going to be diving deep into the life and crimes of Dallen Bounds, a serial killer who was in South Carolina in the late 1990s. And the main source that we're using for this deep dive is this Wikipedia article about him. And yeah, we're going to be unpacking Bounds' past and kind of trace his descent into violence and try to understand what led him to commit such horrific acts.
You know what makes Bound's case so interesting? It's unsettling. Is that he doesn't really fit the typical profile of a serial killer. He was described as friendly, personable, he held down jobs, he interacted with his neighbors. But then behind that facade was a man capable of incredible brutality.
It's almost like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing, you know? I mean, on the one hand, you have this seemingly normal guy, but then on the other hand, you learn about the framed lynching picture in the KKK Bible that were found in his apartment. Kind of a stark contrast.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it speaks to the dangers of judging someone based only on their outward appearance. We have this tendency as humans to categorize people
Hmm.
and to assume that we understand them just based on these superficial interactions. But Bound's case is really a reminder that darkness can lurk beneath even the most ordinary surfaces.
So let's rewind all the way back to the beginning. Bounds was born in Oregon, but grew up in Washington state. And from what we can gather, his childhood seemed relatively normal. But then there's this kind of blip on the radar. He spent some time in juvenile detention. And unfortunately, those records are sealed, so we don't really know what landed him there.
Right, and that's a crucial missing piece of the puzzle here. What happened during those years? Were there signs of aggression, maybe even early acts of cruelty? Or was this just a single incident, a youthful mistake, one that didn't necessarily foreshadow the darkness that was to come? It's really impossible to say for sure.
It's almost like this unknown period in his life casts a shadow over everything that follows. And then at 21 years old, Bounds commits his first major crime, burglary with an accomplice, stealing multiple firearms.
And this is where we see that first clear indication of criminal intent, and a willingness to escalate. This wasn't just petty theft, it was a calculated act with some potentially dangerous consequences. And the fact that he targeted firearms is concerning. It suggests some level of premeditation and a possible fascination with violence.
And both Bounds and his accomplice were convicted and served time, but as we know, this is just the beginning of his criminal journey.
Yeah, unfortunately. Over the next few years, Bounds is arrested a few more times for theft.
Yeah.
And during his prison stints, there are rumors that he started developing ties with white supremacist groups.
So now we're starting to see a pattern emerge here, right?
Right.
We've got a history of criminal behavior, potential exposure to some extremist ideologies. It's like there's early warning signs, those whispers of trouble are starting to grow louder.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, were there any missed opportunities for intervention? Could someone or something have diverted him from this path? Or was this trajectory, this descent into darkness, was it inevitable?
It's a chilling thought, but it seems like for a while, Bounds might have been trying to turn his life around. He gets married, has a kid, moves to Arizona, and even enrolls in beauty school.
It's like he's grasping at normalcy, trying to build a new identity for himself. But like we see so often with people who have a history of trauma or instability, the past has a way of resurfacing, disrupting even the best of intentions.
And that's exactly what happens. The marriage falls apart. There's a domestic violence charge. It kind of paints a picture of increasing instability and maybe a struggle to manage his anger and impulses.
We don't have access to bound psychological evaluations, but it makes you wonder if there were some underlying issues, maybe some undiagnosed mental health conditions, that contributed to his inability to maintain healthy relationships or control his behavior.
Yeah, and eventually he ends up in Greenville, South Carolina, staying with some friends. And this is where he meets his first victim, Jonathan Lara, who was an employee at Radio Shack.
And what's striking about this first murder is how random it seems. Bounds ties Laura up, stabs him in the neck with a screwdriver, and then robs the store. The level of violence seems excessive for what appears to be a simple robbery.
Yeah, there's a disconnect between the motive and the method. Makes you wonder if there was something more going on, some deeper rage or aggression that was unleashed.
Yeah, the lack of a clear and easily discernible motive is something that keeps coming up in Bound's case. It's one of the things that makes it so perplexing.
So we're seeing this pattern of escalating violence. And 6 months after that Radio Shack murder, Bounds strikes again. This time, it's Karen Hayden, a young mother working at a flower shop.
What's really disturbing about this murder is that there doesn't seem to be any connection between Bounds and Hayden. He just walks into the shop in broad daylight, slits her throat, leaves her body in the back room. No apparent motive, no robbery. They didn't know each other. It suggests that he's impulsive and has this disregard for human life that's really unsettling.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if this was just a crime of opportunity. Or was there something specific about Karen Hayden that set Bounds off? Do we know if investigators ever looked into that?
Well, unfortunately, the Wikipedia article doesn't have those details. It's possible that they looked into it, but we can't know for sure without access to their files. I think what we can say is that this second murder is a big shift in how Bounds was operating. The brutality is increased, and the fact that the victim seems random is a big concern.
It's like he's getting bolder, more reckless, and that's terrifying.
Yeah.
But as we know, the violence doesn't end there. On December 23, 1999, just a few weeks after Karen Hayden's murder, Bounds commits a double homicide, killing Sandra Ott and her ex-husband Timothy.
And now with this case, we see a possible element of personal animosity. Bounds had developed a brief infatuation with Sandra. He even left rose petals on her driveway, but she rejected his advances. It's possible that this rejection is what fueled his rage, leading to this act of violence.
So we've gone from a seemingly random robbery murder to a cold-blooded slaying with no apparent motive, and now to what seems like a targeted attack driven by revenge. It's like each murder shows us a different part of Bounds' personality, and none of them are good.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's like we're trying to put together this puzzle, but the pieces just don't fit together. We have these little glimpses into his psyche, these flashes of rage, impulsivity, and maybe even a desire for control or revenge, but there's no overarching narrative that explains why he did what he did.
And this unpredictability, this lack of a clear pattern is what makes him so dangerous, right? It's like trying to predict where a hurricane is going to go. You know it's going to cause destruction, but you can't be sure exactly where or when.
Exactly. And this unpredictability is even more obvious during that intense manhunt that follows the Ott murders. It seems like Bounds just vanished into thin air, blending into the landscape, moving from one place to another with this chilling calmness. He even entered homes, asked for directions, had casual conversations with people, all while he was carrying the weight of these horrific crimes.
It's like he's in this weird parallel reality, totally detached from what he's done. And what's really unnerving is that he got into some of these homes just through unlocked doors. It's almost like he was a ghost, just drifting through people's lives, leaving a trail of fear and unease behind him.
It speaks to how vulnerable we all are. Even in our own homes, we're not totally safe from evil. It shows how random tragedy can be. The idea that anyone at any time can become a victim.
Yeah, and this sense of vulnerability, of impending danger. It all culminates in the terrifying hostage situation at the home of Martha Browning and her granddaughter Deanna Tinsley. We know Bounds got into their house pretending to be someone he wasn't. Can you imagine the shock and horror they must have felt when they realized who he was?
It's an absolute nightmare. Bounds confessed to the murders to them, cut off Browning's medical alarm, basically held them hostage in their own home. It's a chilling display of control and manipulation.
But even in the middle of this terror, there's this incredible act of bravery. While Bounds is distracted, Martha Browning manages to tell her neighbor, Carl Burkett, about the intruder. It's an amazing example of quick thinking and courage under pressure.
Absolutely. What Browning did undoubtedly saved lives. It's a good reminder that even when things are at their worst, human resilience and the instinct to protect others can shine through.
And Burkett immediately calls the police. They quickly surround the house. As officers are closing in, Bounds realizes he's trapped. He panics, looks out the window, then turns back to see an officer coming into the room. And in that moment, with nowhere to go, he makes the tragic decision. He raises his gun to his head and takes his own life. It's a tragic end to what was already just a horrific series of events. Even though Bounds is gone, the investigation continued right.
Oh yeah, they still had a lot to figure out. The evidence that they found in Bounds' apartment, like a bloody knife and clothes, directly linked him to the murders of Jonathan Lara and Karen Hayden.
Oh, wow. So that confirms what we were thinking, that the violence was escalating. But what about the Ott murders? Did they find anything connecting Bounds to those?
Well, they didn't find any physical evidence that directly linked him to the Ott murders. But investigators believe that his infatuation with Sandra Ott and the fact that she rejected him gave him a motive. Remember those rose petals he left on her driveway? It seems like something he would do. A weird mix of romantic gestures and aggression.
Yeah, it's a chilling reminder that even things that seem harmless can have some darker intentions behind them. And speaking of darker intentions, what happened to the people involved in the Laura murder, Cassandra Laster and Noah Nedrow?
They were both charged as accessories to the crime. Laster got a 15-year sentence for helping Bounds avoid getting caught after the Radio Shack murder, and Nedrow got a 5-year sentence for his involvement.
So even though they weren't directly involved in the murder, they still face some pretty serious consequences for helping Bounds. It shows how his actions affected a lot of people, not just his victims, but also the people who got caught up in his web of lies and violence.
Exactly. And that's an important thing to remember when we talk about the effects of violent crime. It's not just the people who were directly hurt who suffer. It's their families, their communities, even the people who were just barely connected to the person who committed the crime. The trauma spreads outward, leaving scars that can last for generations.
You've mentioned a few times now that one of the most puzzling things about this case is that there's no clear motive for Bounds' crimes. Do you have any thoughts on that based on your expertise?
Well, it's easy to try to find just one explanation, one simple answer for why Bounds did what he did. But human behavior, especially when it comes to this kind of extreme violence, is rarely that simple.
So you're saying we might never really know why Dallen Bounds committed these acts?
It's possible. We can look at what we know, analyze his past, think about his mental state, but we'll never really know what was going on in his mind. And maybe that's the scariest part of it all. It makes us realize that there are limits to what we can understand, that sometimes evil doesn't have an easy explanation.
It's a sobering thought. We've covered a lot in this deep dive, but it feels like we're just getting started.
I think that's how it is with these complicated cases. They bring up more questions than answers. They force us to look at what we think we know about people and why they do bad things. And hopefully they make us want to keep learning and trying to understand, even when we're looking at the worst parts of humanity.
This deep dive has been a dark journey into a truly disturbing case. We've followed Dallen Bounds' path into darkness, explored the impact of his actions, and we've wrestled with the questions that still remain about why he did it. It's a stark reminder that evil can disguise itself, and the search for understanding never really ends. If you're interested in learning more about this case, or you just want to learn more about the complexities of criminal psychology in general, there are tons of resources available online, and we encourage you to keep digging and exploring, and most importantly, keep thinking critically about these kinds of cases.